Julian is a married man, but tonight he's acting like a total creep. It's February 13th, Valentine's Eve, and he's shamelessly hitting on Elena, the woman I've been trying to find the courage to talk to for months. He's doing it right in front of his wife, and honestly, it's pathetic. I'm sitting here being socially erased by his noise, but I've got one thing he doesn't. A weird 3 OM habit of reading social psychology stuff. I used to think it was just useless junk I hoarded because my life was too quiet. But tonight, that science is my only weapon to dismantle this idiot's act, win over my crush, and make sure I'm not the one spending Valentine's Day tomorrow alone. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the smell of overpriced roses. The restaurant was packed with men desperately trying to secure a win before the clock struck midnight. Julian was vibrating with a frantic energy, like he was trying to pack a year's worth of cool into one dinner before the reality of his failing marriage set in tomorrow. Elena, the newest addition to our circle and the woman I had spent 6 months mentally preparing to impress, was currently trapped between the salt shaker and a monologue she clearly didn't have the password to escape. This was supposed to be my night. This was supposed to be the moment where I finally moved from that guy who knows a lot of weird facts to the guy Elena actually thinks about when she's alone. Instead, I was a ghost. I was being socially deleted by a man who wasn't even supposed to be on the guest list. I don't have a PhD, but as I watched Julian's hand hover just an inch too close to Elena's, a switch flipped. I realized I wasn't just at a boring dinner party anymore. I was in a high-stakes social laboratory. And Julian? He was the lab rat. This was about to become a totally accidental, completely unauthorized masterclass in group dynamics and neuroscience, explained by a needy layman who just happens to know why your brain is currently being hijacked. If you want to know how to be the center of attention, you usually buy a book by a guy in a suit. But tonight, you're getting the reverse manual. I'm going to show you exactly how Julian is owning this room, why it's pathetically predictable, and how I, the guy currently being ignored, I'm about to use the science of human behavior to take the remote control back. Julian is the kind of guy who doesn't just enter a room, he occupies it like a hostile army. He's Carol's husband, a guy who probably once had a personality but eventually traded it in for a midlife crisis and a desperate need for a fan club. Carol, bless her heart, had clearly checked out years ago. She was sitting 3 seats away, staring at her phone with a kind of intense focus, usually reserved for surgeons or people who are desperately trying to ignore their own marriage. The rest of us, we were the collateral damage. But Elena was different. She was the newcomer, the fresh perspective, and to a guy like Julian, she was a shiny new battery for his fading ego. I could see the moment he locked onto her. It wasn't about a connection. It was about the hunt. He needed to prove he was still the main character, especially since the rest of us had already stopped believing in his act. He shifted his chair with a heavy, deliberate scrape against the hardwood floor, effectively creating a wall between me and Elena. It was a move so classic it was almost funny, the silent get out of my way to the guy he considered no threat at all. He started with a Dubai story, his voice rising just enough to make sure no other conversation could survive. I watched him closely, and that's when I felt it, that weird buzzing sensation in my head. I realized I wasn't just annoyed anymore. I was seeing the specimen Julian was about to attempt a full-scale emotional hijacking. He was following a blueprint he didn't even realize he was using, the same one I'd spent months analyzing in those dense psychology books. He was trying to turn himself into the power source, the single point of energy that everyone else had to orbit. He wanted to be the one who decided if the night was a success or a failure. He thought he was playing a high-level game of social chess. He had no idea I was sitting there, quietly watching him lose his queen. He leaned in, eyes gleaming, ignoring the fact that his wife's indifference was palpable. The stage was set, the victim was unsuspecting. Showtime. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my water, trying to stop my hands from shaking. This wasn't just a fun experiment. If I pulled this off, I'd actually have a chance with Elena. If I failed, I'd be the guy who tried to act cool and ended up looking as desperate as the man I was trying to deconstruct. Julian just let out this booming, table-rattling laugh at his own joke. One of those laughs that's designed to force everyone else to join in just to make the awkwardness stop. And it worked. Elena laughed. Carol gave a faint, tired smirk, and the air in the room suddenly felt like it belonged to him. If I hadn't spent my Tuesday nights reading up on Elaine Hatfield, I would have just felt small. But instead, I saw the signal. Hatfield is this researcher who basically proved that emotions aren't as private as we think. She called it emotional contagion, and it's the exact reason why Julian was currently winning. See, the human brain is an incredible machine, but it's also shamelessly, aggressively lazy. Thinking is expensive. It burns through glucose like a V8 engine. To save energy, our brains are constantly looking for shortcuts. In a social setting, the biggest shortcut is autosync. We are biologically programmed to sync with the strongest emotional signal in the room. It's like social Wi-Fi. When we're in a group, Our brains scan for the most intense frequency, so we don't have to do the hard work of deciding how to feel ourselves. Julian knows this not because he's a scientist, but because he's a social parasite. By being the loudest, most high-energy person at the table, he was broadcasting a massive 5G signal. He wasn't just laughing. He was setting the real-time environment. Elena's brain, being a normal, energy-efficient human organ, simply connected to the strongest network available. She started smiling because her nervous system was literally syncing up with his. He had turned himself into the thermostat, and everyone else was just a thermometer, dutifully measuring the heat he was creating. I sat there, watching the syncing happen in real time, and it was fascinating. It wasn't charisma, it was a biological hijack. He was exploiting a glitch in our operating system to make himself the center of the universe. Julian thought he was being a legend. I realized he was just a guy with a loud transmitter, and I was the only one who knew how to pull the plug. It's an invisible dance, and Julian was leading with iron shoes. I checked my pulse. I was sinking too. I needed to disconnect. Julian wasn't just laughing. He was anchoring. Most people think of influence as a subtle game of persuasion, but Robert Cialdini, the guy who basically wrote the manual on how we get manipulated, proved it's much more primitive. He called it social proof. In any given social situation, there's a fog of uncertainty. We don't know if the joke was actually funny, if the wine is actually good, or if it's okay to be loud. We look for a reference point. Julian, in all his uninvited glory, was providing that point with the subtleness of a sledgehammer. He wasn't just a guest anymore. He had become the social thermostat. See, a thermometer just measures the temperature of the room. It's passive. Most of us are thermometers. We walk in, sense the vibe, and adjust our behavior to match. But the thermostat? The thermostat decides what the temperature is going to be. By reacting to his own stories with such absolute, unwavering certainty, Julian was forcing the rest of the table to accept his version of reality. If he laughs like it's the funniest thing ever said and you don't, you're the one who feels out of sync. You're the glitch. It's a psychological hijack. Elena was leaning in, her eyes following his gestures, not because she was necessarily fascinated by his jet skiing mishaps, but because Julian had successfully anchored the room's energy around his own ego. He was exploiting our brain's need for social consensus. If the loudest guy in the room acts like he's the king, our lazy System 1 brains often just say, "Okay, long live the king," because it's easier than starting a revolution. I watched him take another aggressive sip of wine, looking around the table to confirm his dominance. He was basking in the social proof he'd manufactured out of thin air. It was a masterclass in being a married but available nightmare, and it was working perfectly. I felt this surge of annoyance, but also a weird sense of clarity. Julian wasn't a force of nature. He was just a guy using a very old, very effective psychological lever to control the entire evening. And the best thing about levers, once you see them, you can move them. It was time to finally find my own. Elena finally managed to reclaim the floor. She started talking about her work in sustainable architecture, actual substance, unlike Julian's Dubai fan fiction. But Julian didn't just step back and listen. Instead, he shifted gears. He didn't interrupt her immediately. He did something much more insidious. He started back-channeling. If you've ever been trapped in a conversation where someone won't stop chirping, "Yeah, totally," or "right on," every 5 seconds, you've witnessed Victor Ingves' linguistic theories in the wild. Ingves realized that communication isn't just about the person speaking. It's about who is holding the audio line open. I call it the idling engine technique. Imagine you're at a red light. Most of us sit there quietly, waiting for the green. But Julian's got his foot on the gas and the brake simultaneously, revving the engine so the noise never stops. By constantly making these small, supportive noises, he was keeping his motor running in the conversation's background. He wasn't being a good listener. He was occupying the channel. It's a subtle form of territorial marking. By vocalizing while Elena spoke, he was signaling to the group that he was the exclusive recipient of her story. He was building a private, two-person bubble right in the middle of our dinner. To the casual observer, he looked fascinated. To me, he looked like a social hacker attempting a brute force neural connection. There is a Princeton researcher named Uri Hassan who calls this neural coupling, the phenomenon where a listener's brain starts to mirror the speaker's brain. Julian was trying to force his brain into a high-intensity duet with Elena's, creating this bizarre, inappropriate intimacy while his wife, Carol, was 3 feet away, staring into her glass as if she were hoping the wine would suddenly become a portal to another dimension. It was a pathetic, mechanical display of social engineering. He was ensuring that when Elena finished her thought, his voice would be the only one authorized to follow. He wasn't just waiting for his turn, he was sabotaging mine before I even opened my mouth. I was being socially deleted by a series of enthusiastic, fake sincere grunts. He wasn't listening, he was just claiming ownership of the air. The man has serious issues with reality, but he certainly follows his scripts. Julian was basically a human megaphone at this point. I could see the moment he decided that my conversation with Elena had gone on long enough without him being the center of it. She was telling me about a museum she loved in Madrid, and I was just about to tell her I'd been there too, when Julian decided to merge into my lane without a turn signal. He didn't even wait for a breath. He just started barking about some wild night he had in a tapas bar. In the past, I would have hit the brakes. I would have done that polite, slightly embarrassed, "Oh, sorry you go" thing that makes you feel about 2 inches tall. But I'd spent a few late nights reading Cecilia Ridgway, and she had this one point that stuck in my head like a catchy song. She calls it status signaling, but in my head, I call it the finish line rule. It's simple. In a collision of voices, the person who stops first is the one who effectively vanishes. It's not about being loud, it's about who has the most mass. So instead of shutting up, I just kept going. I didn't shout, I didn't get aggressive. I just stayed at my own speed, finishing my sentence about the architecture in Madrid while Julian was still trying to talk over me. For 3 seconds, it was pure chaos, 2 voices overlapping. But because I didn't flinch, the interruption actually made Julian look like the one who was out of sync. He was the noise, I was the signal. Across the table, Carol's fork scraped against her plate, a sharp nails on a chalkboard sound. She didn't even look up, but for a second, our eyes met in the reflection of the window. She knew she was watching her husband get outplayed by the quiet guy, and for the first time all night, she looked vaguely impressed. When I finally finished my thought and looked at him, he actually blinked, startled. He had to reset his entire brain just to find his place again. He looked like a guy who'd tried to walk through a door that was actually a wall. And Elena? She didn't look at him with admiration. She looked at me with this tiny, surprised smile, like she'd just realized I wasn't just another guy waiting for permission to exist. I felt a massive surge of, I actually did it, adrenaline. I wasn't a master of anything. I was just a guy who finally didn't get run over. It was a win. A small, quiet, beautiful win for once. The vibe at the table was getting weirdly heavy. Julian was leaning so far into Elena's personal space, he was practically in her soup. All while his wife, Carol, was sitting right there, methodically cutting her chicken like she was practicing for a divorce hearing. It was beyond pathetic. Julian tried to fix the vibe by loudly ordering another bottle of the most expensive red on the menu, snapping his fingers at a waiter who was clearly already overstretched. It was the ultimate power move that actually signaled total weakness. Elena shifted in her seat, her body language literally turning 10 degrees away from him and toward me. There's a specific kind of cringe reserved for a married guy trying to play the alpha bachelor at a dinner party. He thinks he's James Bond, but to the rest of us, he just looks like a midlife crisis with a LinkedIn premium account. He was in a full-blown pre-Valentine's panic. He was performing for his own ego, trying to outrun the fact that tomorrow he'd have to buy a last-minute card for a woman who clearly couldn't stand the sound of his breathing. To him, Elena wasn't a person. She was a shiny distraction from his own calendar. It was time to stop just defending and actually start a conversation that didn't involve his ego. I remembered this guy from Princeton, Yuri Hassan, who studied neural coupling. He found that when someone tells a really engaging story, the listener's brain waves start to mirror the speaker's. They literally sync up. Julian had been trying to force this with volume and fake mysteries, but you can't hack a brain with a sledgehammer. You need a melody. So I ignored Julian's latest "I'm a big deal" lead-in and asked Elena about something real. I told a quick, slightly self-deprecating story about my first week living in a tiny apartment with a leaky roof and a cat that hated me. It wasn't a legend story, it was a human one. I watched the coupling happen in real time. Elena's posture relaxed. Her eyes weren't just following me. She was actually there, inside the story with me. We were on the same frequency. Meanwhile, Julian was left revving his engine in the driveway, completely invisible. Seeing him realize that his wife was disappointed and his target was bored was the highlight of my month. He was just a guy with a wedding ring and a loud voice, and I was the one finally making a connection. It wasn't about being a master of science. It was about being a person who actually listens. The table didn't belong to the loudest guy anymore. It belonged to us. Julian? He was just failing to notice that his own marriage was becoming a ghost story. It was incredibly cringy, honestly, but also a massive relief. I finally understood that you don't need to be an alpha to win the room. You stay real. Julian was drowning, and he was trying to save himself by showing off how perfect his life was. He started lecturing the waiter, a poor kid who just wanted to go home, about the vintage of the wine. It was painful to watch. Julian wanted to be seen as the ultimate authority, the man who never fails. He was leaning into this persona of the immaculate alpha, oblivious to the fact that his wife Carol was now openly scrolling through her phone, probably looking for a divorce lawyer or a vacation in a country where Julian did not have a passport. This is where I remembered Elliot Aronson and the pratfall effect. Aronson discovered that people who are perceived as competent actually become more likable when they commit a small, clumsy mistake. But there is a catch. If you are already seen as a jerk, a mistake just makes you look worse. Julian was trying so hard to be flawless that he was becoming a statue. Cold, rigid, and completely unapproachable. He was a perfect version of a guy nobody actually liked. I decided to lean the other way. As I was reaching for the salt, I accidentally knocked over my empty wine glass. It did not break, but it made a loud, clumsy clatter. Smooth, I muttered to myself, loud enough for Elena to hear. I laughed at my own clumsiness. Not a forced laugh, but a genuine, I am an idiot chuckle. Julian looked at me with pure disdain, probably thinking he had finally found a reason to look down on me. He took the opportunity to make a snide comment about basic coordination. But Elena? She did not look at him. She smiled at me. That small slip-up had humanized me. It broke the tension Julian had been building with his fake perfection. By showing a crack in the armor, I became someone she could actually relate to, while Julian's relentless pursuit of being the best just made him look like a tired, aging predator in a suit that was a bit too tight. He was the villain. I was just the guy who could laugh at himself. And in that moment, I knew I had won the night. Julian had become a caricature, finally. The check finally arrived, and Julian snatched it like it was a trophy. He wanted to be the benefactor, the big spender, even though his wife, Carol, looked like she'd rather be anywhere else on Earth. I didn't fight him for it. Why would I? I'd already won the only currency that mattered in that room. While Julian was busy scrutinizing the tip and lecturing the waiter one last time about the notes of oak in the wine, I turned to Elena. There was no information gap now, no status signaling. It was just two people who'd actually had a conversation. I remembered something else I'd read, a bit of Robert Cialdini's liking principle. People don't just like people who are like them. They like people who make them feel seen. Julian had spent 4 hours trying to make everyone see him. I'd spent the last hour making Elena feel like the most interesting person at the table. It wasn't a hack or a trick. It was just being a decent human being. As we all stood up to leave, I didn't ask for her number in front of the group. I waited until we were walking toward the door, away from Julian's loud posturing. "Hey," I said, keeping it low-key, "I'd really like to hear more about that museum in Madrid, without the commentary." She laughed, a real warm sound that made the whole stressful night worth it. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed my phone, typed in her name, Elena, and added a little lightning bolt emoji. "Text me," she said, before Julian tries to invite us to a yacht party. I walked out into the cool night air feeling like a giant. I wasn't a social scientist or a pickup artist. I was just a guy who decided to stop being a background character in his own life. Julian was left in the lobby, arguing with his wife and holding a heavy bill for a dinner where he'd lost the only thing he actually wanted. As I pushed open the heavy glass door of the restaurant, the sound of Julian's voice was finally cut off by the street noise. The transition was instant. Inside, it was a theater of egos. Out here in the real world, his alpha status didn't mean a thing. I felt the cool breeze on my face and realized that for the first time, I wasn't replaying the night's embarrassments in my head. I was just thinking about that museum in Madrid. I took a deep breath, smiled at the moon, and realized that sometimes the best way to win the game is to simply know that you're playing it. It had been a very long night, but I was finally walking home with hope for tomorrow. I checked my phone one last time before heading upstairs. A new notification? Elena with a lightning bolt. Looks like my Valentine's Day plans just got a lot more interesting.